All right, so as you've seen throughout this Camp PBG blended Empower Learning course, this PD, we are looking for teachers to sort of redefine and rethink the way they build their coursework, their assessment plans, their instruction, to try to make things more relevant and performance assessment and problem-based, inquiry-based. To do that, we're going to talk about creating a certain type of thought process and template for performance assessment. We're going to call that peak performance assessment. This is an acronym that we got from the Most Likely to Succeed video, and it's all based around the way you think about creating performance assessments for students and designing instruction around them. So very quickly, just to review, a performance assessment is a learning activity that asks students to perform or demonstrate knowledge, understanding, and proficiency in certain skills. And a performance assessment should yield observable results. That could be anything from a conversation to a demonstration to something actually physically created or anything in between. It serves as evidence of learning in the appropriate standards. It is delivered throughout the unit. That means that the kids know about it all the way through. And all of their assessments are sort of building toward or part of the larger performance. That means that that final performance, what we usually call the summative, is not something that's hidden until the last day. It's something that's introduced and available for students to think through, ponder over, research about, practice on the very first day of instruction. And then everything is built to move back towards that big idea. And then the final performance requires application of various skills, not simply recall of information. So very quickly, peak performance. We're going to go through the acronym. There are a lot of questions that I'm sort of throwing up here as we go through. But basically what I want you to understand about the P, which is purpose, is that we want to create relevancy and we want to create meaning and purpose for students' learning that is beyond the scope of your specific classroom. Instead of just thinking about getting through curriculum in my classroom, I want to think about presenting curriculum in a way that is interesting and engaging to students, that makes it more likely for them to be interested in the learning in your class and tie it to other classes and the larger world around them. And so that's where this last point, this last thing in bold comes in. When you're building, be conscious of, are there skills that would happen in other courses that could be applied in the project or the performance that you're trying to make for students? Quite often, when you're doing something in social studies, it also involves some science. It also involves English. It could also involve math and all the way around like that. This happens in so many of our subject areas. And if we can be more attentive to that, then we can be more engaging in the way we build instruction and show kids how there is relevancy from what seems like it's disconnected or maybe they won't need it in the future. We could show them how it all fits together and make learning in high school less siloed off. The E stands for essential skills and mindsets. And this is basically, have you identified things in your priority? Does your assessment reach all the levels of appropriate level 2 thinking and base knowledge, and then application and larger analysis skills at level 3? Does your entire unit allow for missing skills to be identified and for students to reattempt and continue to grow? And ultimately, are the habits of work and some of those soft skills we're looking for a part of the learning so students can continue to grow on the things they will need out in the workforce? Can they own their work? Can they set goals? Can they persevere? Can they communicate well with others? Can they collaborate? Try to make this stuff all a part of every unit design. And on top of that, we want to give students as much agency as possible as we're moving through it. And again, I'm just going to kind of go through some questions quickly. You've got the slideshow presented to you, but the main gist of all of these questions is we want to make sure that we write performance assessments and instructional plans that allow for students to have choice in how and what they access in terms of resources to learn material, in which ways they're going to assess and show mastery of material, and how they're going to perform their understanding of their learning There's many ways for them to do it, and quite often we do not have to just make one assignment for students. We could ask them to do a various number of things to engage, assess, practice, and ultimately perform. And also, throughout the course of your planning, this is where the concept of universal design for learning is going to come in. How do we help make sure all of our student populations can access the material from their level and from their perspective? How do we make sure that our students with IEPs, that our English language learners, that 504 plans can access the material, organize thoughts, have choice and agency in how they assess as well? And then how do we make sure that our assignments are engaging but also not inaccessible to certain people simply by the way you ask the question in terms of genders, ethnicities, different linguistic groups? Are there stereotypes involved you might not be aware of? And then finally, there is proper knowledge. And again, basically, the goal of everything we're doing is to create transfer. We want to transfer knowledge and skills beyond the scope of the 3 or 4 week unit that we're working on. Linked along with this presentation is going to be this video that it says here for proof, or you can click the link in the slideshow, which is also presented. And basically the video says that kids don't remember anything past a couple of months. The same kids that got A's on tests are failing them. But you can go watch that video and get more proof of that. How do we build out spiraling of knowledge throughout the process of a learning experience? And then how do we make sure that that learning experience was robust enough for students to be able to actually take and learn it? And if you think about when you go to learn on your own, not say maybe for summer training like you're listening to right now, when you want to do authentic self-directed learning, how differently do you retain the information? I know myself personally, I usually remember the stuff that I want to go out and figure out how to do. Not so much when I'm told to go figure out how to do something. So how do we help build this? When we know we have guaranteed curriculum that we have to get to, how do we build the closest thing we can to a situation where students really want to go own it? A large part of the answer to this that Peak is aligned with is the idea of inquiry and problem-based learning. Right? Peak performance should be centered as often as possible around open-ended inquiries, big questions, real-world solvable problems. And our goal is to make learning less rote and less test preppy, and more relevant, accessible, and engaging, lasting, transferable for our students. In order to better create this world, we have to rethink the way we plan. We have to get really good at backwards planning. I know that's not a new concept, but it's often in practice. I know this is what I did. It's very different than what actually happens. I have a skeleton of what I'm going to do, and then I plan forward. I make sure tomorrow's ready. To make sure about this, our template is basically based on understanding by design, and that basically allows for the time and space to build out a performance task based around a centered learning experience where you ask essential questions and students work through skills that are aligned to standards in order to answer these inquiry questions and solve these large problems. And then universal design for learning allows us to make sure that all of our students have access, going back to that agency portion. How do we make sure all of our kids can access the materials, learn on their own, and have scaffolds for where they are in their learning? Right? This is a very quick slide that overviews universal design for learning. And if you notice quickly here, this is a lot of what we're trying to get done anyway. We want to allow for multiple means of students to engage, create interest, work through their struggles, and persevere and be persistent. And then how do they self-regulate if they're being engaged or not? How do we show things to students various ways? How do they see videos? How do they get the same information presented to them 3-4 different ways? How do we make sure that we're being aware of the language being used and the symbols presented so students have different ways to see things? And also, how do we make sure that students have different ways to express their learning and take action because of their learning? Why of learning, what of learning, and how of learning. In order to help us plan all of this, we have attached, and you guys are going to be asked to fill out this backward planning for peak performance template. It's basically an understanding by design rubric that emphasizes the notion of peak. It's got 3 stages. In stage 1, basically, you're looking at the purpose, the essential skills and standards, and the knowledge that we're trying to transfer. So basically, stage 1 is what you're hoping to get out of this, right? What are the standards aligned on the left? What are students going to be able to know, do, understand? And then in the meaning portion here in the center, the big point to get is the essential question. How are we going to build something in these 2 boxes that will make sure that students can come up or create a connection to this learning that is beyond just the scope of, this is the next thing on my prioritization list. It's the next standard in the scope and sequence. How do we get them really invested in going to figure out the answer? Stage 2 is creating that assessment plan. So once we've got a great question for students to answer, we've got to come up with the task they're going to ultimately be working toward. And that's here. And that's, again, where we want to focus on making sure it's an authentic task, that it's relevant, that students have agency in the way they're going to show that it's based on those big essential questions, and that students are going to be able to ultimately answer them in a way of relatively of their choosing, and that makes them interested in coming up with an answer. And then also on the left, if you see that evaluative criteria portion, that's sort of like making sure that we've aligned what a 3 looks like on the standards. We often do this in PLCs and scales and rubric creation. How are we making sure we're going to align everything for what looks good, no matter which way students choose to perform their task? And then also the other evidence here is going to be the smaller formative assessments that show up along the way. Tests, quizzes, homework, different practice that kids are going to be able to show pieces of the skill before they do the ultimate performance task. And the third part is the learning plan. And this looks really small here and on the template, but it's actually probably going to end up being the longest, because it's really just sort of a step-by-step / day-by-day / possibilities laid out of how the learning is going to go from beginning to end. So you think of this as like the ultimate planning area. And the idea here is that you work through this for all of your standards, or group your standards together and come up with a learning plan. Just very quickly to go back to this does not have to be one standard at a time. In fact, it would probably be better if, as much as possible, some classes aren't really structured this way, but if you can get multiple standards in here and build one essential question out of several standards, then the learning is already tied together. It's not so rote. It's not so one at a time. And we just kind of want to build these things out. And then these templates are going to be the basis for how you build your playlists in Empower. So those of you using the LMS in Empower, this document and this planning is going to be super important for your building in Empower.